Hello. Welcome back to the second part of our Lund lecture series featuring Professor Tremper Longman III from Westmont College. The second lecture that we give today on the Song of Songs is entitled God Loves Sex, a theological reading of the Song of Songs. Also, I might want to draw your attention for those of you who are joining us for the second part. There is a flyer on the new book that Dan Allender and Professor Longman have published together called God Loves Sex. And so if there's anything about today's lectureship that you find intriguing and you want to read more, please feel free to pick up a flyer. They're on the podium up here. They're also in the lounge area where our refreshments are. And welcome back those of you who are joining us through live streaming. A reminder to those who are watching us online, there's opportunities to ask questions after the lecture. Please post your comments and your questions, and our academic dean, Stephen Chester, will field those questions and ask them on your behalf during the lecture. So without further ado, let's welcome back Tremper Longman.
Thank you very much. I anticipate, though I shouldn't make promises, that my lecture will be somewhat shorter than the first one, allowing for more possibility of questions. So hopefully you'll have some questions. Maybe just a quick word about that book, God Loves Sex, which I just got an email from the publisher, appeared in the warehouses yesterday. So, but it's a book that is not an academic approach to, we hint at and maybe discuss a little bit some of the issues that I'm talking about here, really laying the groundwork for what we talk about in that book. And in our past two books together, the previous one being a book called Breaking the Idols of Your Heart, How to Navigate the Temptations of Life, we've chosen a biblical book, and the first one, Ecclesiastes, to explore the question of where we find the meaning of life. We call this our midlife crisis book. And in the second book, it's exploring the Song of Songs, as I say, as a resource for thinking about our sexuality, and in particular, recognizing that God created us as sexual beings, and knowing that Christians, for various reasons, have struggled just with the whole idea of sexual desire. So thus the subtitle, An Honest Conversation About Sexual Desire and Holiness. Because some people, most recently in a book by Kevin DeYoung, in his book on holiness, which has many good aspects to it, but his chapter on sexuality, or his comments on sexuality, I find extremely unrealistic, and apparently he did too, because he keeps saying, this isn't how I acted while I was dating my wife, but now that I look back on it, you should act this way, which is, which is essentially the argument that you should treat your future spouse like your sister, not in the Song of Songs sense, of course, until you get married. And that whole, he doesn't use this term, you know, kind of no kissing till you get married, or no dating till you get married, I find deeply troubling. But, in any case, what Dan and I do in these two books is we combine fiction with sort of exposition, or talking about the topics. Dan has written a very compelling story about a Bible study group sitting around studying the Song of Songs together, and the people are kind of thrown together to talk about sexuality and the Song of Songs, and brings out different issues. So kind of interested to see how that is received. I figured this will be the book that everybody's embarrassed to buy. But I say, you know, Kindle. No one sees the cover. It is kind of a provocative cover. That'll at least get you to look at it. So, all right. Now, In the first talk, we emphasized the major theme of the Song of Songs, which is, as I said, a celebration of sexuality. And I haven't yet really situated the book within the canon, and I will be doing that in the second part of my talk. But before we do, I wanted to talk about this secondary theme, which is, one way to put it is, there are certain subtle and not so subtle indications within the Song of Songs that the type of sexual intimacy that it is celebrating is not easily achieved. In other words, the Song of Songs is a realistic book that understands that, we are all broken people, and that we'll talk about it more biblical theologically later. Excuse me 1 second while I just sort of adjust my notes here a bit. Okay. So, in this talk, I'm going to actually start with specific texts in the Song of Songs to illustrate what I'm talking about. And I'm going to start with a very subtle indication in a poem that's found in chapter 2, verses 8 through 17. So turn with me to chapter 2, 8 through 17. Here the woman is speaking, and she says, "The sound of my lover. See, he's coming, leaping over mountains, bounding over hills. My lover is like a gazelle or a young stag. He's now standing behind our wall, staring through the window, peeking through the lattice." Don't think about that too carefully. Sometimes this is called the peeping Tom, but the idea is he's getting close. And he's getting closer and closer, but they're still separated by a wall. My lover responded and said to me, "Rise up, my darling, my beautiful one, and come. For now the winter has passed, the rains have come, they've gone. Blossoms appear in the land." And here we see this age-old theme of springtime as a time of intimacy and lovemaking. It's a time for taking clothes off, not putting them on. Though Santa Barbara, it's kind of year-round, but sorry, Chicagoans, enjoy your good weather. I will too. The fig tree ripens its fruit, and the vines in blossom spread their fragrance. Rise up, my darling, my beautiful one, and come. My dove, in the crevices of the rock, in the hiding place in the cliff, let me see your form. Let me hear your voice, for your voice is agreeable and your form is pleasant. Grab the foxes, the little foxes. They're ruining the vineyards, our vineyards in bloom. My lover is mine and I am his. He grazes among the lilies. Notice that intriguing, kind of surprising, grab the foxes before they ruin the vineyard. The vineyard is the locus of physical intimacy, of lovemaking, and this kind of runs throughout the song. And the next poem we'll read will bring this out as well, that the countryside, the vineyard, the garden is a place of intimacy, whereas the city is hostile to this intimacy. But here, even in the garden, there's the possibility of foxes. Who are the foxes? Some people want to make a specific identification. They're rival suitors or something like that. I think the foxes function as anything that might disturb the intimacy of a couple. And it's interesting, when I ask, if I speak on this passage, say at a marriage conference or something, I have a lot of young married couples in there, and I'll say, what are the foxes in your life? Many of you won't be surprised that the number one category aren't rival suitors, but rather children. Okay, so So the fact is that there are these threats to intimacy. But let's turn now to another passage, a passage that is not as playful as this one. Indeed, there's a certain darkness to this passage, particularly as we read it from a modern category, from a modern perspective, and particularly as we read about it in the context where we're having discussions in our society about domestic abuse. And so what I'm preparing us for is a rather shocking use of imagery that, in order to understand what the poet's getting at, we almost have to, I hate to say it, read over. It's not condoning abuse of any sort, but it's making, as metaphors often do, they'll shock us to get us to think about something more. In that regard, I think of Psalm 78, verse 65, which provides us a very surprising metaphor of God. We think about God as the shepherd, God as the father, God as the mother. That's a little shocking to some. God as a warrior. But in Psalm 78, verse 65, it says this: "The Lord awoke as from sleep," which is weird enough. But then it goes, "like the sleep of a drunk soldier." So here God is being likened to a drunk soldier being aroused, and you're invited to think, well, what does that mean? What's a drunk soldier like when you wake them up? And of course, the answer to that is pretty simple. Angry, irritated, and violent, and that fits the context. Okay, with that background, and I say this in part, I'm preparing for this because I've talked about this passage in an SBL context on gender and sexuality, along with Susan Ackerman at Dartmouth, and I forget the other woman, and Cheryl Exum, and they feel very strongly about this poem, so much so that they urged me to disown the metaphor. And with my view of Scripture, I can't disown the metaphor, but simply point out that it's not condoning this kind of behavior by any stretch of the imagination. So the poem is 5:2 through 6:3. And the woman is speaking, and she goes, "I was sleeping, but my mind was alert. The sound of my lover knocking. Open for me, my sister, my darling, my dove, my flawless one. My head is full of dew, my locks with the drizzle of the night." Okay, so first of all, this scene also fits into a well-recognized ancient Near Eastern metaphor for sexual intimacy. A woman opening her door for a man is an invitation for sexual intercourse. It reminds us of another more playful passage in chapter 8, verse 8 through 10, where the brothers speak, and they say, "Our sister is small and she has no breasts. What should we do for our sister on the day she's spoken for?" So they're saying our sister's immature, and as brothers in an ancient Israelite context, we're responsible for our sister's development and eventually will be involved in her marriage negotiations. Go back and read Genesis 34. But then they answer their own question. They say, "If she is a wall, we will build a silver battlement for her. But if she's a door, we will enclose her with a cedar board." And what they're saying here is, if she has not been penetrated, we will come alongside her and help her in her struggle to continue that way until the day she's spoken for, her marriage day. We will honor her. It's a silver battlement. But then they say, but if she's a door, in other words, if she's promiscuous, we will enclose her with a cedar board. They'll say, we'll help her channel her sexual energies. Now, I love the woman's response here. I am a wall, and my breasts are like towers. Okay, in other words, she's saying, I'm ready for marriage. Thus I will be in his eyes like the one who brings shalom. Now, this is interesting. I will be like the one who will bring him, namely my future husband, contentment, peace. But I think, let me pause here to address again the question of Solomon's connection to the book, and also who we're to think the man and woman are. I already mentioned that I think the man and the woman are nameless because the readers are to identify with the characters rather than to read it as some kind of historical statement. But I do think it's interesting that you have as the one male name in the book, Solomon, which in Hebrew, of course, is Shlomo, peaceful one. And that the one time the woman is given some kind of name, she's called the Shulamite. The Shulamite, that's in chapter 7. And the point is that's the feminine form of Solomon. So isn't it interesting that Shlomo and Shulamite get together to produce Shalom? I think that's kind of suggestive. Okay, back to chapter 2. The man is asking the woman to open the door to him. It's a very sensual picture of him with his head full of dew, locks with the drizzle of the night. And then verse 3, she responds by saying, I've taken off my clothes, should I get dressed again? I've washed my feet, should I get them dirty? Which, if you'll excuse me, is a poetic way of saying, I have a headache. Basically, not now. And I think this passage is filled with double entendre. As you well know, feet are often, and other appendages are used as euphemisms for genitalia, both male and female elsewhere. Certainly, I agree with the majority of Ruth scholars, including, if I remember correctly, Bob Hubbard in his excellent Ruth commentary, that Boaz's feet are is a euphemism for his genitalia. Basically, Ruth, encouraged by Naomi, is saying to Boaz, marry me and marry me right now. And he talks about the other possible candidate. So, verse 4, my lover sent his hand through the hole. It often translated lock, and it may be that, but the Hebrew word is hole. And then it goes, and my me'i, my innards, a word that doesn't have to be, but can refer to the erogenous zones, roiled or heated up. The word here is heated up toward him. In other words, now she's becoming aroused. And then I stood up to open to my lover, and my hands dripped myrrh, and my fingers liquid myrrh on the handles of the lock. I opened to my lover, but my lover had gone away, he had left. So here the man approaches the woman for intimacy, but she backs away. But when she's ready to approach him, he's gone. Now, the rest of the poem, which we'll read, describes her search for him. She doesn't just simply accept the fact that he's gone, but she goes out, and she goes out into a dangerous realm in order to find him. She goes out into the city. My spirit had gone out at his speaking. I sought him, but did not find him. I called him, but he did not answer. The guards found me, those who make their rounds in the city. They struck me, they bruised me, they lifted my garments from me, those guards of the walls. And here's the most disturbing part of the poem. She goes out, and basically the police see her out there, presumably at night, a woman wandering around alone. Perhaps they think she's a prostitute, but they then physically and the hint is even sexually. They removed her garments from her. Now, what's shocking is that she doesn't even reflect on this experience. It doesn't cause her to even hesitate in her pursuit of her desired loved one. So poetically, I think this is expressing the idea that the emotion of love, her desire, is so great that it even propels her to move against societal convention. Societal convention. I don't think they represent, you know, moving against the Torah or anything, but it is a kind of like bucking the system, so to speak. And, you know, it's interesting the way the woman in the song interacts with her brothers, who you'll remember, too, are societally charged for kind of negotiating for her marriage. But she doesn't treat them very well because they are clumsy in their approach to her. Now, remember, this is a poem, so the poet has some latitude as to what characters he creates. And one of the interesting absences from the Song of Songs is there's no father. There's talk about the mother. The mother is basically her teacher in matters of love, but the father is never mentioned. And, you know, it's an argument from silence, but if I ask the question, why isn't there a father figure in it? And I think probably because the father figure would have proven too potent an authority figure for the woman to kind of interact with, in the way she interacts with the brothers, and even sort of doesn't pay any attention to the city guards here. As I say, she doesn't, in verse 8, she just simply turns to the daughters of Jerusalem, the chorus, and says, I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, if you find my lover, what should you say to him? That I'm sick with love. And then the women, rather than simply saying, okay, they question her. They say, how is your lover better than another lover, O most beautiful of women? How is your lover better than another lover, that we should so swear? Now, this is a poetic way of setting up an opportunity for her to give a descriptive poem about the man. And again, it's equally erotic, especially if the translator is given free rein to reflect what's in the text, I would argue. Because my lover is radiant and ruddy, distinguished among 10,000. His head is pure gold. His locks are wavy, black like a raven. His eyes are like doves by water streams, bathing in milk, sitting by pools. I mentioned that in the earlier talk. His cheeks are like spice beds, growing aromatics. Now, this is kind of strange to a modern audience, but of course, his cheeks would have had a bushy beard, so it's like a spice bed. And there would have been cologne or some kind of pleasant scent that he would use in his beard. His lips are lilies dripping with liquid myrrh. His arms are bars of gold set with Tarshish stones. Now, it is interesting, too, to see that a lot of the imagery that's used to describe the man is almost as if he is a statue, you know, and it would be suggestive almost of a kind of idol made out of gold. And certainly, I don't believe the text is trying to create a false idol out of the man, but it is suggestive of her high regard for him. Now, it's 14b that is particularly toned down in most of our public translations, which typically say something like, his body is like polished ivory, right? That's what your translation says, as if this guy's imagined as having a kind of, what's that term, a Johnny Six-Pack or something. But let's just remember the natural form that ivory comes in, and a more appropriate translation is, his member is an ivory tusk ornamented with lapis. Again, we saw with the woman some frank description of her vagina, and the same thing's true here. The Bible is not prudish. So then it goes, his legs are pillars of marble founded on gold pedestals. His appearance is like Lebanon, choice like the cedars. His palate is sweet. He's totally desirable. This is my lover and this is my darling, O daughters of Jerusalem. The women of Jerusalem respond. They're now interested. They go, where did your lover go, O most beautiful of women? Where did your lover turn that we may search for him with you? And then this poem ends with the suggestion that there will be union in the garden. My lover went down to his garden in the bed of spices to graze in the lilies, to graze in the gardens, to pluck the lilies. I belong to my lover, and my lover belongs to me. He grazes among the lilies. So again, yeah, the song is largely a celebration of sexuality, but also recognizing that it's not easily achieved. And indeed, on 3 occasions, in 2:7, 3:7, and 8:4, the woman will turn to the chorus and say something to the effect, well, let me just read them, probably I'm paraphrasing. 2:7, I adjure you, daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or the deer of the fields, not to awaken or arouse love until it desires. So she's making them swear not to arouse or awaken love until it desires. Interestingly, asking them to swear by the gazelles or the deer of the fields. Now, typically, of course, in the Bible, you swear by the name of the Lord Almighty. And let me just say, if you read by the gazelles or the deer of the field, it actually echoes that more religious oath. So there's a very interesting intentionality not to explicitly mention Yahweh in the Song of Songs. Some people detect Yahweh mentioned in chapter 8, verse 6, I think it is, but I think that's wrong. I think Yah at the end of this word is a superlative, but we could talk about that later perhaps. So, so she's saying, I think, and there are different ways that this admonition has been interpreted. One of the more popular ones is kind of a do not disturb sign. In other words, don't disturb me till I'm done here, women. I think better in the context is the idea of you don't rush into it. This can be a wonderful thing, but it's not something to quickly rush into. So, so those are the main texts, and maybe even the only texts where you get this kind of warning. Why the warning? Why the warning? Well, I think that's probably an easy point to make, in that all of us have been broken in the area of sexuality in some form or another. You know, we've all experienced shame and guilt and other difficulties, or we felt an illegitimate kind of jealousy or envy toward others. In other words, God created us sexual beings, but our sexuality has been broken in multiple ways. This is not something that is easy to enter into, or else we have desires that are unrequited and we feel angry and bitter about them. To simply celebrate sexuality would be kind of a false view of our present human experience, which of course is a post-fall experience, but I'm waiting just a little bit more before we get back to Genesis 2 and 3. And so, and I'm not sure I'm going to spend a lot of time on this, but aside from the Song of Songs, the Hebrew Bible and also the New Testament spends a significant amount of time what we might call channeling our sexual energies. And so much of the law has considerable sections on proper and improper sexuality and marriages. So I just thought this will probably raise more questions than it will answer, but I just thought I would address 3 common questions in this regard. The first thing, though, let me just present what I think is the proper way of reading the law in the Torah. First of all, there's no doubt about the fact that in the Old Testament, the law is never a means to a relationship with God. In the Old Testament, law is based on grace. How do we see that? Well, you see it just from the move of redemptive history, you know, that it isn't God gives the law and says, obey these laws, and if you do, then I'll get you out of that smoking furnace, Egypt. No, he saves Israel from Egypt, then he gives them the law, and Exodus 20 verse 1, which is the preface to the 10 Commandments, goes, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. I've already extended my grace to you. We are in relationship. Now, here's my law as an expression of the best way for you to live and also to maintain your relationship with me. Because, and you can see it in the very structure of the covenant as well. The covenant which is a metaphor of our relationship with God modeled on an ancient Near Eastern treaty. Such covenants begin with a historical prologue which recounts God's gracious acts toward Israel, and then it's followed by a section of law. You could see this both in the ancient Near Eastern treaties as well as in books like Deuteronomy, and then is followed by rewards and punishments. Rewards for keeping the law and punishments for breaking the law. Now, as you look at the law section in either Exodus 19 to 24 or the book of Deuteronomy, you have, of course, the 10 Commandments at the beginning, followed by a number of case laws. Now, the 10 Commandments are given in a form that's technically called apodictic law, which are sort of statements of general ethical principles. And I'll choose the 7th commandment because that's the most relevant here. You must not commit adultery. And then the function of the case law that follows is to apply those 10 general ethical principles to specific situations according to what I would call the sociological and redemptive historical situation of the people of God at the time. So let's take you must not murder. You must not murder is applied in Deuteronomy in a case law that says you must build a fence around your roof. You must build a fence around your roof. Well, why? Because, you see, roofs were living space back at that time. And if you didn't have a fence, people would fall off, injure, or kill themselves. Okay, I'll come back to that as we talk about Christian appropriation of the law. So in the case of you must not commit adultery, there are many passages, but 2 that are particularly relevant are Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20. And here you not only have a prohibition of certain types of sexual relationship. I mean, you get other laws that prohibit rape, etc. But in Leviticus 18 and 20, you have the prohibition of certain types of marriages. And this is, of course, very controversial today. You have not the first part tends to be generally accepted, that there are certain relationships which we would define as incestual, which are prohibited. So close relationships, familial relationships, you can't marry, and of course, only within marriage can you engage in sexual intercourse according to the Torah. And others as well, including, and here's the controversial part, of course, homosexuality. So it's in the case law that you have the explicit prohibition of homosexual marriage and sexuality. And so, but you also have, and I want to bring this up for a purpose, you also have the prohibition of having sex with a woman who's having her period. All right. Now, as we move to the New Testament, and we think about our relationship to the law, I would suggest the following. Number one, the New Testament does not abandon the law. The New Testament agrees with the Old Testament that you don't earn salvation by keeping the law, but the New Testament recognizes, and Jesus most famously in Matthew 5:17 and following, not a jot or tittle of the law will pass until it has been fulfilled or accomplished. It presupposes that the law is still an expression of God's will for how we as human beings should live and flourish. However, of course, there have been changes from the Old Testament to the New Testament time so that particularly our appropriation of the case law isn't as simple as saying all the case law still applies today. However, let's go back to the fence law. In the law about the fence, it would be quite awkward and wrong-headed to simply say, well, in America today in the 21st century, you have to build a fence around your roof. I don't know about you, but I don't go up on my roof except to watch the fireworks on the 4th of July, and it would be kind of fruitless to build a fence. It's not a way of protecting human life. However, that case law gets me thinking about my own house. And I live in a time period where houses are constructed differently. That case law is going to tell me I better build I don't have a pool. I better have a lockdown top on my jacuzzi in my backyard so somebody can't go in there and drown. Or if I have little children in my house, I better put little plug guards in there so they don't electrocute themselves. And if they do, then according to the law, I am responsible for that. Now, what about the sexual laws? And I'm focusing in on the issue of homosexuality because it is the most controversial issue today. And as I look at Leviticus 18 and 20, the question I have to ask, is there a difference between the New Testament and the Old Testament, because our relationship is one of continuity and discontinuity, that would lead me to believe that either the incest laws or the law about having intercourse with a wife who's having her period, or about homosexuality, is there anything that would indicate to me that there's a difference in my redemptive historical situation that would cause us to be in discontinuity with the Old Testament? I submit to you in terms of incest and homosexualty, no. Indeed, the New Testament seems to reaffirm those ideas in the New Testament. But in the case of having sex with a woman who's having her period, the whole idea of women's reproductive blood was connected to the purity laws of the Old Testament. If you read Leviticus, I think it's 13, 14, and 15, there are laws that are saying that you shouldn't come into contact with either, well, you shouldn't come into contact, let me put it this way. The purity laws are typically not more issues of morality. The purity laws are teaching other matters. And in the case of semen and women's reproductive blood, the idea here is that life is holy and that these are what I would call holy fluids. And to come into contact with them, you come into contact with something holy and therefore you are rendered unclean. Remember what we talked about in the last hour about, say, touching the scroll of the Song of Songs renders the hands unclean. So it's a way of highlighting the holiness of life. But these purity laws and all the ceremonial laws are fulfilled in Christ. And according to Matthew 5:17, they've achieved their purpose, so we don't observe them anymore. Well, I may have raised more questions than I answered, but as I say, we're going to have a longer question and answer period later. I would also encourage you to take a look at William Webb's excellent book, Slaves, Women, and Homosexuals, where he rightly points out that there are certain trajectories on certain ethical issues as you move from the Old Testament into the New Testament and even beyond when it comes to women and slaves. But he points out that you don't get that same kind of trajectory when it comes to homosexuality. Now, maybe I should say a word about polygamy, because one of the things I said about the Song of Songs is that it celebrates sexuality as an exclusive institution. But of course, during the Old Testament time period, polygamy was tolerated and regulated. It wasn't prohibited. There's no question but that Genesis 2, as it defines marriage, defines it in a monogamous fashion. But the law does allow for polygamy. And indeed, you turn to the New Testament, and the indications are that a man who's married to more than one wife could be a member in good standing of his church. So polygamy is not eradicated in the New Testament either. However, there is an indication that there's a move toward what I would call the Edenic ideal, when the officers of the church and the pastorals are said they must be the husband of one wife. Now, I've noticed that in some modern translations it's translating things like should be faithful to his wife. I think we should take that phrase literally. That is, you could be a member of a church if you're in a polygamous relationship, but you can't be an officer in the church. But that's kind of a sign that you're moving toward the Edenic ideal. Just like with divorce, the Old Testament law doesn't mandate God's ideal all the time. Remember what Jesus said when his disciples were questioning him about his more narrow definition of divorce. He said, well, Moses spoke that way because of the hardness of your heart. But now we're moving closer to the Edenic ideal. So, and just one more comment on this. Again, maybe get a lot of questions about this whole section later, but I was once on a panel. Matter of fact, it was the same panel I was alluding to earlier with Cheryl Exum and Susan Ackerman, which the other member of the panel was a man who was one of the editors of the Queer Study Bible. And he was making the point, well, you know, there's so many laws in the Old Testament about food, we don't pay any attention to them anymore. So why do we bother to think about the sexual laws? And as I thought about it, I thought about divorce, I thought about polygamy, I thought about all those other issues connected to sexuality. And actually, it's interesting, while the food laws loosen up, the sexual laws tighten up as you come into the New Testament. It's an interesting thing to contemplate. He taught at the Chicago School of Divinity, but I should have realized he was Jewish, so my New Testament argument didn't have much effect on his thinking. But but it did on mine. Okay. Well, now let's situate the Song of Songs in its canonical context. And in this section, I will address some of your concerns about the theological contribution of the Song of Songs. Because so far we've really been looking at it from the perspective of love poetry and what it tells us about our relationships with each other. The first thing I would point out is that we should ultimately, of course, read the Song of Songs within the canon, not as a separate book. Indeed, it is possible to read the Song of Songs as a book outside the canon on its own and say it's kind of a manual of free love, which is essentially the argument of André Lecoq, surprisingly French, who he also taught at the University of Chicago, I believe. And Lecoq, in his book, Romance She Wrote, which always struck me as an odd title of a book, sort of suggests that the Song of Songs is some kind of ancient love manifesto. Brevard Childs, even before Lecoq wrote, of course, the sort of one of the major shapers of the modern canonical approach to interpretation, simply said this: you cannot read the Song of Songs in the canon in association with the Torah and think that this has to do with love outside of marriage. In other words, the Torah does provide a canonical context to read about the sexual intimacies in the song. The next thing I would say, and here's where I appeal to Phyllis Tribble in her excellent book, God and the Rhetoric of Sexuality. Tribble pointed out that what we have here in the Song of Songs is a biblical theology of sexuality in 3 parts, she says. The first part is Genesis 2, where the man and the woman are in the garden, they're naked and they feel no shame. But of course in Genesis 3, because of sin and the disruption of human relationship with God, there's now a disruption in the relationship between Adam and Eve, which is signaled by them immediately covering themselves up. So, and then also, of course, mentioned in the punishment directed at the woman, which of course has effects for the man as well, it says, your desire will be for your husband, but he will control or rule over you. Now, the word desire here has been pointed out by Susan Foe and others, is a rare word for desire that doesn't mean romantic desire. It means the desire to control. Genesis 4, it occurs twice, and the most relevant occurrence is in Genesis 4, where God says to Cain, Cain, sin is crouching at your door and desires you. And of course, the picture we should have in our mind isn't sin, personified sin, crouching at Cain's door saying, open up, Cain, I want to make out with you. It's, I want to come in and dominate you. So Genesis 3 tells us, because of human rebellion against God, our relationships, and in particular our relationships, the male-female relationships, are going to be troubled and difficult. And indeed, if the story stopped there, it might be a pretty bleak picture. But the Song of Songs is, as read within the canon, is harking back to Genesis 2 and 3, because the man and the woman are in the garden again and feeling no shame, but enjoying each other. In other words, the Song of Songs, one theological reading is the Song of Songs is about the redemption of sexuality. And that's where Tribble leaves it, and it's very helpful. But I would simply, based on what we said in the first part of this talk, go on and say, yes, it's an already not yet redemption. It's an already not yet redemption. We're not back in the Garden of Eden yet. We may get glimpses, but we're not back in the garden. Just like in terms of our redemption, we're still looking forward to entering the promised land, as the author of Hebrews would put it, going into the New Jerusalem where there'll be 2 trees of life. So in the area of our sexuality, it's already not yet. That raises a very interesting question, doesn't it? Very interesting question. What about sex in the eschaton? You ever thought about that? Actually, I probably shouldn't share this, but when I first became a Christian the summer before college, I went off to Ohio Wesleyan. It was during the Jesus Revolution, and I had a fraternity friend who just became a Christian too, and his evangelistic approach was basically, and he had been addicted to pornography beforehand, and he would go around to people and say, heaven's going to be a big orgy, you know, and so that was his kind of evangelistic appeal. Masses became no. All right. So, but what about sex in the eschaton? Here, I'm kind of I've been influenced by the writings of Lewis Smedes, the relatively recently departed professor of theology, who wrote a book, titled something like Sex for Christians, but it's a very profound, accessible theological reflection on sexuality. And first of all, of course, you have to deal with Luke chapter 20, don't you, where Jesus is talking to some Sadducees who don't believe in the afterlife, and they're trying to ridicule this man, Jesus, by pointing to that woman who's had 5 husbands and saying, who will be your husband in heaven? And he responds by saying, you know, in heaven there'll be neither giving nor taking in marriage, but we will be like the angels. Okay? Now, if you read that through the prism of, again, the Middle Ages, and you think about angels as sexless spiritual beings, that will lead you in one direction. But no Jew, I think, in the first century, or few Jews maybe, and I would argue no one in reading the Hebrew Bible would come to the conclusion that angels are inherently asexual because of Genesis 6, 1 and following. Where that enigmatic passage where the sons of God marry the daughters of women and they have the Nephilim, which was clearly understood in intertestamental literature as angels marrying human women. And Jude seems to allude to this back, you know, when he's talking about various types of sexual transgressions, as he's saying your false teachers are sexually transgressing as they're trying to teach you. And remember the angels. Seems to be an allusion to Genesis 6 there. So I'm not sure that it's totally decisive to refer to Luke chapter 20 to imagine our heavenly existence, as it often is, as a kind of, we'll be sitting on clouds, separate clouds, by the way, I don't want to get too close, and strumming our harps, etc. Now, I'm not suggesting, and Smedes doesn't suggest, that heaven should be envisioned as a great orgy. But you see, sexual intercourse is a moment of one flesh togetherness, a kind of bodily, spiritual, emotional union. You kind of lose yourself in each other. That may just be a kind of taste of the kind of communal life we will all have together. You know, so sex may just be a little taste, and that's why some thinkers like Mike Mason in his book on marriage will sometimes talk about the Lord's Supper as a moment of union with Christ that's analogous with sexual intercourse. And that leads me to my final comment. And that is, I forget when I started, so I don't know whether I'm over time or under time, but that's okay. I'll continue in my oblivion. Okay, good. And that's a final theological reading. Again, reading the song within the context of the canon. There's nothing within the song itself that would lead to the following reflection, but reading it within the canon certainly would. And that is simply to point out that throughout the Bible, there is a robust metaphor, one of the many metaphors of our relationship with God, which is the marriage metaphor. Indeed, God is the husband and Israel is his wife in the Old Testament. And of course, sometimes it's hard to see because almost always that metaphor is used in the light of Israel's sin. And so there are little glimpses of the good old days in Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 3, or in Hosea chapter 2, which looks back on the day when they were like newlyweds. But typically, famously in Hosea 1 and 3, Ezekiel 16 and 23, and everywhere it talks about Israel committing adultery against the Lord, there's a negative use of this metaphor, but it presupposes the marriage. It presupposes the marriage. And by the way, the reason why there is an interesting connection between that's the metaphor of adultery is very significant. It's very reasonable. What's the best word? It's a good metaphor for idolatry because these are the only two exclusive relationships. In other words, you can have only one God and you can have only one husband in the Old Testament. And therefore, when one breaks their relationship with God, it can be likened to an adulterous marriage. Okay, so read within the context of the Old Testament, the more we learn about human marriage, its passion, its intimacy, its beauty, etc., it's informing our relationship with God. And of course, that continues into the New Testament, doesn't it, in Ephesians 5:20 and following, which likens the church's relationship with Christ to a marriage, citing Genesis chapter 2, or Revelation 19, the first half of Revelation 19, which talks about the future wedding supper of the Lamb. So this metaphor continues into the New Testament. So, and I've listed some of the passages there: Jeremiah 2:1, Hosea 2:2, Isaiah 54:7, Ephesians 5:20, and Revelation 19:6 and 8 on your outline. Therefore, let me conclude by simply saying, and again, directly in answer to the earlier questions, were the allegorists wrong? You'll remember I said yes and no. They weren't wrong in the sense that the Song of Songs informs us in terms of our understanding of who our God is and what our relationship to him is like. It's one of multiple metaphors, all of which should be considered as we think about the nature of God. He is indeed our shepherd, our king, our warrior, our mother, our father. He's also our husband. All these should inform our understanding of who God is. But they were wrong on 2 counts. Number one, they were wrong to do an end run around the sexual meaning of it. They were wrong not to recognize that it is a celebration of human sexuality. And then number 2, they were wrong to utilize the details of the text and assign them what I would consider arbitrary symbolic significance. So I'll bring my formal comments to a conclusion here and open it up for questions, but my hope is that we've been able to illumine Song of Songs a bit, and so you could begin to see the potential of the song as we think about Christian approach to sexuality.
Looking at the clock, and we have 10 full minutes for questions, so please go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll pass along the mic. Yes. And please, again, give us an introduction of who you are as your first question.
My name's Joel. I'm a first-year Master's of Divinity student. A couple of points that you brought up before in terms of that the Song of Songs is almost an ideal version, almost hard to obtain. And then with that same point, that with the namelessness of the male and the female, that the reader is supposed to identify themselves into that story. My question is, how do we as pastors with those two ideas help people who don't feel like they can identify as those stories? Because, I mean, you talk about, there's the funny line of, oh, the woman had all her teeth, but there's people that don't feel that same beauty, and they don't feel that they fit into that that situation. So how do we, as pastors, help them approach this conversation? Because it's what the divine scriptures say.
Yeah, that's a great question. And one more of my ceaseless plugs for the book, God Loves Sex. There's a chapter devoted to the topic of beauty in there where my friend Dan Allender, the psychologist, does some wonderful thinking, more than I'd be able to share with you now. In the first place, what I would do, broadening it beyond the Song of Songs, is to remind us of another text, which is beauty is fleeting, charm is deceitful. Yeah, but the fear of the Lord, you know. In other words, the virtuous woman, the ultimately desired woman, should be defined by her relationship with God. Now, what the Song of Songs reminds us is that we are also embodied people. God makes us sexual, but it doesn't trump, you know, the virtue of a proper relationship with God. And indeed, all of us, I mean, that's one of the functions of the fall, is all of us feel ugly. I mean, the woman in the Song of Songs, remember what she says. This is kind of interesting. She says to the man, she says, and the reason why we miss this is it's often mistranslated. It's at the beginning of chapter 2. She says, I want to get this right here. She says, I am a flower of Sharon, a lily of the valleys. Now, it's often translated, I'm a rose of Sharon, right? Except roses didn't exist in Israel at this time. They hadn't come from China yet. The words here are, you know, what she's saying is, I'm like every other girl. I'm a wildflower. There are thousands of them. You know, there's nothing special about me. He responds by saying, like a lily among the thorns is my darling among the girls. In other words, she's saying, to me, you know, you make all the other flowers look like thorns. In other words, I guess a trite way of saying is you know, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. There's the metaphorical description of the woman also, you know, it isn't, notice it isn't kind of a precise measurement, like, yeah, she's, what I don't know what ideal measurements would be, but and the other thing is, yeah, so that said, you know, we all struggle in this area. It's part of our brokenness. It's why we want to cover ourselves in front of each other. But we can pray for and hope for, you know, somebody who will find us attractive. There's more to be said on that good question, and I'll appeal to my friend Dan Allender there. Yeah.
I'm Sue, and I'm an adjunct in spiritual formation here. Kind of going along with Joel's question. How do you preach this to people in a congregation? I understand how you would do this for people who are married, who have an ability to express their sexuality through sexual intercourse. How do you include those in your congregation who are single, divorced, widowed, single parents, to include them in this vision? Yeah, and that is a great question. That, first of all, you got to remember, I'm the ivory tower academic who thinks about these issues in terms of practicality, but not as much as how to properly interpret the text. So one of my hopes is simply I get you thinking about questions like this. But one of the things that I would emphasize is whether divorced or single or, you know, most people are dealing with issues of sexuality. They're thinking about it. They're either married or they might get married in the future. So these are things to think about. I think especially for people who aren't married who may get married in the future, these are things you got to think about ahead of time, not afterwards. Or even in the light of a failed relationship, as you think about maybe a future relationship, you should start getting your thinking in order about matters of sexuality. I think everybody deals with the issues, and I would also say that in some of the poems, the woman doesn't appear to be married either. So it seems, and certainly the young women are not married. So they're the actual implied. So one way of thinking, a married couple might identify with the couple. Unmarried people might identify, young unmarried people at least, might identify with the chorus. But it is, you do need to remain mindful of the fact that people are in different situations, obviously, when you're preaching this. And we tried to remain mindful of that too while we were writing this book. We didn't write it in that fictional Bible study group who are dealing with the Song of Songs. There are a couple married couples who are having their own issues within marriage, but there are a couple of, there's a single woman, there's a single man. The main character is a guy named Malcolm who just became a Christian, so he's dealing with, you know, this whole new Christian ethos about sexuality. And also there's, you know, a woman who just got divorced from an abusive husband. So that's one of the ways we try to address those kind of issues in our book, and maybe if you took a look at that, that might be suggestive for ways of preaching it as well.
I'm also wondering if you even just gave an answer with the previous question, the celebration of our bodies, as an expression of human sexuality. Sometimes we limit sexuality to orgasm and intercourse, whereas sexuality is much larger than that. And and people are ashamed of their bodies, and we are made male and female. What does it mean to be male and female in our bodies? And we celebrate that and have that affirmed by a church or community that says we're beautiful people and we're fearfully and wonderfully made, regardless of what the world tells us that, you know, how we should look. And so I'm thinking that you are in the celebration of the vividness of human embodiment in Song of Songs. There's a way for singles to embrace the text.
Exactly. I mean, as a 62-year-old man aging, you know, the body ages, a bit more, you know, sexuality changes. A friend of mine, some of you may know him, I know you know him, the Gades. We're talking to a psychologist friend who was doing some kind of course where they actually watched film where 20-year-olds were having sex, 40-year-olds, 60-year-olds, and 80-year-olds were having sex. And it was a completely different kind of approach, shall we say, as the body ages. But there were still touching scenes of intimacy in all of them, perhaps even more so in the 80-year-olds whose bodies didn't look so attractive, apparently. I didn't see the video, but I can imagine what I'll look like when I'm 80. No, sorry. Actually, yeah. You know, I just got myself in big trouble there. Can you erase that? You know, there's a, if you don't mind, this is a little free association, but you got to remember I'm on California time. I'm beginning to feel the effects. When I started lecturing, when I got up this morning at 6, it was really 4 in the morning. But so allow my free association. But I remember once I was lecturing on the Abraham narrative, and of course, one of the questions that the rabbis had to deal with is why would Abraham be worried about Sarah being sort of an object of attraction to the Pharaoh? After all, in the first story, she's 65, and in the second story, she's 85, okay? And some rabbis come up with some things about old age fetishes. They're making this up among pharaohs. And I was lecturing about this as a real problem, and I had a woman who was 60-something, and she said, you know, that's a little offensive. And then I thought about it. I thought, my beautiful wife, Alice, is 62. I find her very attractive, even, you know, though we both changed since we first got married at the age of 20. So again, when, and even the idea of beauty changes. I wrote a little blurb. Rick Warren has this new book out on the Daniel diet, which I kind of find hilarious. Because, not because his purpose is a good one, but you see, if you read the story of Daniel closely, the look that Nebuchadnezzar is going for, and this is shown by ancient Near Eastern iconography, we have artistic representation of wise men in the Babylonian court from the time of Nebuchadnezzar, and guess what? They're not lean and mean. They are fat, round-faced, bald eunuchs. That's the look that Nebuchadnezzar's going for, and it's quite a risk for them to go on a diet of vegetables and water, because that's not going to achieve. The miracle at the end of it is that they're fat, wise men, even though they've been drinking water and eating vegetables. So that's the attractiveness of, so there are some, yeah, it raises some interesting questions.
I think we have time for one more question, and is there any questions online that, no, okay. No, you are very important. I just want to be sensitive to that.
Hi, my name is Joe Popino. I'm a third-year Master of Divinity student. And you talked about the trajectory of interpreting the sexual case law and how the New Testament shows that there's been this trajectory in a couple different directions for different case laws. And I was wondering if you could comment on how that trajectory is shaped and if there's room for it to change direction.
Well, the observation is made simply by looking at what the Old Testament and New Testament says on these things and sort of observing. And a key text is Jesus's comment about divorce, you know. And clearly he is taking a different view on divorce than the Mosaic law. And he's saying it's because of the hardness of your heart. And so, in that regard, I would see, and there's one big qualification that we don't have time to get into here, but it has to do with the Sabbath law. But I would see the 10 Commandments as expressions of these general ethical principles that then are applied differently between the Old and New Testament. And some of the factors, well, the major factor is the coming of Christ, which fulfills what we call the ceremonial law, which, yes, is a foreign, the division between moral, civil, and ceremonial law is a foreign division to the Hebrew Bible, but it helps us make sense of how the New Testament appropriates the Old Testament law. It helps make sense because we see the ceremonial law fulfilled in Christ, and therefore we don't observe it anymore. We don't offer sacrifices. We don't build temples, etc. You don't do the food laws anymore, because the purpose of those were to keep Gentiles distinct from Jews. Now that Jews and Gentiles are together, you could eat all that stuff. There's nothing healthy about eating a kosher meal. So when it comes to the civil law, that has to do with Israel as a political entity. And that's also another important point of discontinuity. In the Old Testament, the people of God are a political entity. So there are laws about king and judges, and also I would put the punishments of the law in this category as well. You know, the laws had certain punishments associated with them. But now that the people of God are a spiritual entity, the church, that also creates discontinuity with the Old Testament. But in terms of the law, what we call moral laws, which are neither civil nor ceremonial, seem to maintain their validity as an expression of God's will for how we live our life. So I don't know whether that helps a little bit. There are lots of questions.
Well, I invite all of you to talk with Dr. Longman after our close of the lectures. But with this, I would like to say that we are at an end to our lectureship for today. I would like to invite you back for tomorrow's lectureship, of which I wrote down the name. Oh, there they are. Sorry. Tomorrow we are going to have Dr. Beverly Gavanta from Baylor University speak to us about sinners, saints, and I can't even read my own writing in Paul's letters. Lecture 3 is what part of the word all don't we understand? And the 4th lecture of the series, which continues into tomorrow, free and costly grace. So same time, 9:30 and at 10:45. Online viewers, thank you for joining us. I hope that all of you have, sorry, 9 a.m., thank you. 9 a.m. for tomorrow, and then 10:45 a.m. for the 2nd lecture, Dr. Beverly Gavanta from Baylor University. So thank you. Can we give one last hand to Dr. Longman?